Hello, Chattanooga.
Welcome back once again.
So glad to have you here with us this Wednesday morning or whenever you choose to tune in and listen to Footnotes.
Yeah, Footnotes.
What is Footnotes?
Footnotes. We take some time and just recap a little bit about what happened on Sunday, specifically tying some conversations, some additional conversation back into the message from Sunday.
Yeah.
And this past Sunday, Pastor preached on the title, Please.
Please. You know, it was a very interesting. I saw his title beforehand, and I was like, man, he likes doing that. That's like his favorite thing to do is just come up with like those random one-word titles, and you're like, where's he going with this? But he started in James chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. That kind of deal. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And if you look into James 1 and 17 and 18, if you look into what first fruits is, even that's a tithe.
Yep.
Right? The first fruits, that's what he asked a tithe of. And so we that's what James is making that parallel to, a kind of first fruits. We want to be an offering unto God.
It's an interesting concept that, the things that are offered. And if you look in the Old Testament, you look in the history of the Bible and throughout the Bible, it is a very interesting concept when we're talking about first fruits, even going back to Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm.
It was those first fruits, those first offerings that were the most pleasing to God.
How do we know that God's not a vegan?
How do we know?
Because he refused Cain's sacrifice of vegetables. He was like, nah, I ain't having none of that.
So over here, Sam is taking the first fruits concept very literal. But, when we're talking about, even though throughout the Bible, everything that was required to be brought, it was first fruits. And those were the elements that were pleasing to God. They were the most pleasing to God. And it's an interesting parallel as Pastor began to speak on Sunday about taking this concept and this idea of us being first fruits to our requirement or responsibility to seek what is ultimately pleasing to God.
Pleasing. That's such an interesting concept because that's not always how we think of and hear it phrased of how a relationship we are to have with God. There's different ages, I should say, like different times have different ways they relate to God, or they seemingly like the pop culture way. You can think of Jonathan Edwards,
Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
Yeah, and everyone was just scared to death. The Puritans were they were scared to death of everything.
That's the reason they woke up. Because, they began to be afraid of hey, what is this thing he's talking about that kind of has fallen under the radar? Yeah. We've kind of forgotten about it.
And then we've seen in our modern time, if I can, I'm just going to kind of jab at this just a little bit. Peace, love, dove, as Pastor says. Peace, love, dove. Jesus is just, and he is. He's so kind, and that's the way a lot of us relate to him because we need a lot of peace in our life. But in reality, we're his creature.
Yeah,
we weren't created for our pleasure. It's an interesting concept. We were created for his pleasure. We're a tithe and we're an offering. It's present yourselves a living sacrifice,
holy and acceptable.
Holy and acceptable. That's what we were created for. Pastor, he mentioned we are put here with a purpose to please God, and that's it. I mean, that's the end of the podcast almost, there, right?
Right there. I mean, that's the gist. That's the gist of the message. Is that is what we're brought for. I mean,
so if you're missing purpose in life, you're how many people are looking for their passion, their purpose?
Tons.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, like it's it's an innumerable amount of people.
Yeah.
So, and when we think about this, is like, okay, we're put here for this purpose. We're put here to please God, and for His pleasure. But how often are we truly seeking God's pleasure as people? How often are we truly seeking what pleases God instead of what pleases us? And even in the Christian world, we have to guard against these concepts that pop into our mind and pop into even the church culture that really, really, really try to distract and distract from what our purpose is. And that's to be pleasing to God, not to be pleasing to ourselves, to be pleasing to other people, but our ultimate purpose, our ultimate goal should be to be pleasing to God.
Yeah. So Hebrews 11:6 says, "And without faith, it is impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him." The faith piece of that, I can't help but think of the way the way a little kid comes to you. Hey, can I have some candy? I mean, and if you don't have candy, you're going to find some candy, and yeah, you can have some candy.
Even if it's last year's Halloween candy.
Even if it's last
Easter
year.
basket candy or whatever.
Yeah, you're going to and so I can't help but think they're coming to me, or they're coming to an adult, and they're saying, "Can I have this?" Now, it might be 11 p.m. at night, and they're like, "No, you can't have candy." Yeah, but that's also part of that. Their faith is invested in, okay, I know this person is the producer of the candy. This is Charlie in the Chocolate Factory.
And they definitely know who to draw near to for that.
They do.
Yeah.
And so they draw near. And I'm just not built. I mean, AG's not old enough yet to have me calloused, and so I'm just not built to say no very well. So yeah, I'll find some candy. God, I think God, He says, "Least you come as little children," right? Yeah. When we approach God in that faith-driven manner of knowing that He's the supplier of all our needs, God, I need some help with this. He'll send help.
Yeah, He will. I mean, that's exactly, if you read through the rest of Hebrews chapter 11, designated as the faith chapter. It begins by talking about this piece about without faith, it's impossible to please Him. And then he goes on, as Pastor even alluded to and discussed on Sunday, is that there's all these options and all these opportunities and all these examples of those that allowed their faith to draw them closer to God. And as such, as each of those things happen, by faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, Abraham. I mean, all these different heroes of faith all began by simply trying to draw near to God.
In that, one of the key moments, the key points that reassures me in faith. Okay. And it's not every time. It's just, and it's maybe this is just a personal thing. It's not. I'm gonna preface this. It's not a point of earnings, but I found that when God, I need some help here. I am stepping out in faith. I am doing this in faith, and God, I want you to know. I want to remind you. It's what they did in the Old Testament. God, I want to remind you. I've been faithful. Yep. I've paid my tithes. I've given of my time, talent, and my treasures. I've been faithful. God, I'm needing a little help here. I'm needing some help. And in that faith, and I understand that that may be a little immature type faith there. Yeah. But there is something of a reassurance of, even when maybe I haven't been as faithful as I'm supposed to be, God's still faithful. He's more faithful than I am.
There's an interesting concept about that the premise is that we've got to remember, as Scripture says, remember the former things of old. Like, remember what has transpired before. Why did they set the stones in the Jordan River.
God, you've done this before.
It's like it's a reminder, not just to the individuals, but to God that, hey, look, you've done this. And as Faith, as Pastor talked about Sunday, as he kind of recounted some of the journey that CAC as a church family had been on, and the processes of going through all that, that every step through this had to be in faith if we were going to please God. And if we ever step outside of walking in faith, then the opportunity, the likelihood is that pleasing and becoming part of God's pleasure is not going to exist.
And in that slight deviation here, a lot of times, and if you grew up in a religious household, of whatever flavor, but a lot of times we grow up in necessarily we have this fear built in, right? Because our reasoning is not always developed. It doesn't develop till later. It's just hardcore facts right there.
Yeah, truth.
And so we are at a young age, we develop a fear-based relationship with God or point of reference with God. Don't do that. You're gonna die and go to hell.
Well, and I think part of it may be tied to some of the Bible stories we learned early on, is that we see so often God's judgment through those stories, but oftentimes we don't see like God's grace and his mercy and compassion. Like,
and I'll say grace and mercy and compassion. There's something that it's really hard to understand as a concept, even as an adult, much less a kid. So I don't want to demonize anything here. It's okay, that happens. But it leaves us with this residual of a question: will I go to hell for this? Yeah. That it leaves in a lot of people get stuck with that question right there of, will this send me to hell? And it's like, hang on, buddy, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not the judge. But can we rephrase this? Can we say, is this pleasing to God?
I mean, Paul wrote in Corinthians about this process, right? Mm-hmm. Not all things are lawful, or all things are lawful, but not all things are the best processes. They're not, all things are not pleasing to God. It doesn't necessarily mean they're right, wrong, whatever, but not all things are pleasing. So often we develop this mindset. And we're being pulled by the humanity, the flesh, this all the things of this world. We're being pulled by those things, being pulled by them. And we're missing out oftentimes on the drawing of God's pleasure.
Yeah.
Like, we're being pulled by these things, and God's over here saying,
for whoever, is impossible without faith is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and he. So if you want to draw near, you've got to have that faith.
Yep. Absolutely.
Got to please God. I've got, it's not how far away can I get from God and still be kind of saved.
It's often reminds me of, I know we kind of chatted about this a minute ago, but it reminds me of in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, the Cold War era of history. Like, there was this concept called brinkmanship, like going to the brink, right? The brink of nuclear war, the brink of utter destruction. And so often it seems like as we are giving into the pull of humanity, the pull of worldly desires, the pull of worldly and the flesh that's a part of this, when we're giving into that as opposed to the drawing of God's power, it's almost like we're reliving this brinkmanship concept. And while it's not nuclear war, it is spiritual destruction that we have to be cautious of and understand that our ultimate purpose, as you said earlier, and just kind of coming back to that full circle, our ultimate purpose as followers of Christ, our ultimate purpose for existing as human beings is for God's pleasure.
Yeah. So then I want to close with this, because this is kind of how Pastor ended with a question: is 3 things that I can do to bring pleasure to God. How can I be pleasing? David put it into song. How can I be pleasing to you, Lord? What can I do? And if we look at it in that same humble and meek attitude, God, how can I be pleasing to you? I think our entire world would change. I know it would. We wouldn't we wouldn't have nearly as many laws.
It's the power of the right question.
Yeah.
The power of the correct question.
What's pleasing to God? Now, somebody's going to like take that and run with it and just do all kinds of weird stuff and terrible things. But really and truly, that's why it's a conversation between you and God, because God will convict you. He'll lead you. He'll guide you. He'll direct you. God, what can I do to be pleasing to you? I want to say thank you so much for joining with us today. And I challenge you this week, make sure that you are praying that. Take a moment to pray that. God, what can I do to be pleasing to you today?
Yep.
Anyway, it's another good day of Footnotes.
Yeah. So look us up. Make sure you find us on the web, cachattanooga.org.
Yeah.
Look us up on all the socials. Tune into service with us. We'd love for you to worship with us online. And thank you for joining with us today for another Footnotes.
Yeah.